Standing in that marble-floored mansion, watching my birth parents look at me with disgust and suspicion, I felt the same crushing weight in my chest that I'd carried for 55 years. The woman who gave birth to me actually stepped backward when she saw me, her diamond-covered hand flying to her throat like I was some disease she might catch. My birth father didn't even try to hide his contempt as he sneered at my simple dress and worn shoes. After 5 decades of wondering, dreaming, and hoping, this was my reunion. 2 billionaires treating me like I was there to rob them blind. My name is Linda Mae Harrison, and this is the story of how I waited 55 years to meet the parents who abandoned me, only to discover they were worse than I ever imagined. But what they didn't know was that their discarded daughter had raised a son who would make them pay for every tear I'd ever shed. The journey to find them had taken me 3 years of private investigators, legal battles, and sleepless nights. I'd been left at St. Mary's Children's Home in Detroit when I was just 2 days old, with nothing but a pink blanket and a note that said, "Please love her, because we cannot." For 53 years, I'd carried that note in my wallet, reading it until the paper became soft and the ink faded. Growing up in foster care had been a nightmare of neglect and abuse. I'd bounced between 12 different homes, never staying long enough to feel wanted, never finding the love that note had begged strangers to give me. By 16, I was pregnant and alone, kicked out of my final foster home for bringing shame to their Christian household. I'd given birth to my son Marcus in a county hospital, holding him close and promising him something I'd never had, a mother who would never abandon him. Raising Marcus as a teenage mother had meant working 3 jobs, sleeping on friends' couches and eating crackers for dinner so he could have real food. I'd scrubbed floors at night, served coffee at dawn, and stocked shelves in between, all while finishing high school through correspondence courses. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I watched Marcus grow into a kind, brilliant young man who never once made me feel ashamed of our humble beginnings. The private investigator had finally tracked down my birth parents last month. Richard and Elizabeth Thornton, billionaire real estate moguls who owned half of Manhattan's skyline. They lived in a $50 million penthouse and owned homes in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Monaco. Looking at their photos online, I'd searched their faces for any resemblance to my own, any sign that I truly belonged to them. When I'd called their lawyer to arrange a meeting, I'd been interrogated like a criminal. They'd demanded proof of my identity, background checks, and signed documents stating I wasn't seeking financial compensation. The message was clear. They thought I was just another gold digger trying to cash in on their wealth. The day of our meeting, I'd stood in my tiny apartment bathroom, staring at my reflection and trying to imagine what I'd say to the people who'd thrown me away like garbage. I'd chosen my best dress, a simple navy blue one I'd bought for Marcus's high school graduation, and my only pair of good shoes. Looking at myself, I'd realized how different I must appear from their world of designer gowns and luxury cars. Their penthouse had been everything I'd expected: cold, pristine, and intimidating. The doorman had looked at me suspiciously, the elevator operator had remained silent during our ascent, and even their housekeeper had eyed me with distrust. I was clearly not the type of person who belonged in their world. When Elizabeth Thornton opened the door, the family resemblance had been unmistakable. We shared the same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting our heads when we were thinking. But where I'd hoped to see recognition, maybe even joy, I'd found only cold calculation and barely concealed disgust. Richard had been worse, looking me up and down like I was something unpleasant stuck to his expensive shoe. They'd led me to their sitting room, where I'd perched nervously on a chair that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, while they'd positioned themselves behind their massive marble coffee table like it was a fortress wall. The conversation had been brutal in its coldness. They'd made it clear that they viewed my appearance in their lives as nothing more than an extortion attempt, despite my lawyer's assurance that I sought no money from them. Elizabeth had actually laughed when I'd tried to explain that I'd just wanted to meet them, to understand why they'd given me away, to maybe find some connection to fill the hole in my heart that had ached for 55 years. But as I sat there, absorbing their cruelty and feeling smaller with each passing minute, my phone had begun to ring. The caller ID had shown a number I recognized immediately: Marcus, calling right on schedule like the devoted son he'd always been. And suddenly I'd realized that these cold, heartless people were about to discover exactly who their discarded daughter had become. I'd let the phone ring 3 times before answering, watching Richard tap his Rolex impatiently and Elizabeth examine her manicured nails with obvious boredom. They thought this was just another interruption in their busy schedule of counting money and looking down on people like me. Marcus's warm voice had filled the room as I'd put the call on speaker, just like we always did when he called during his busy days. He'd been calling from his dressing room between television interviews, his voice slightly breathless from rushing between appointments. My son had always made time for me, no matter how crazy his schedule became. The moment his voice had echoed through that cold penthouse, everything had changed. Richard's head had snapped up from his watch, and Elizabeth had gone completely still, her face draining of color as recognition dawned. They'd exchanged a look of pure shock, then turned to stare at me with new eyes. Eyes that now saw not a potential threat to their bank account, but the mother of someone they couldn't ignore. You see, my Marcus had become something extraordinary. While I'd been scrubbing floors and serving coffee to put him through school, he'd been quietly building an empire of his own. Marcus Johnson. Yes, he'd kept my maiden name despite my marriage to his stepfather, had become the most sought-after actor of his generation. His last 3 movies had each grossed over $1 billion worldwide, and his production company had just signed a 5-year deal worth more money than most small countries' budgets. But more than his fame or fortune, Marcus had become everything these people weren't: kind, generous, and fiercely loyal to the woman who'd raised him. He'd bought me my little apartment, insisted on paying for my health insurance, and called me every single day no matter where in the world his career took him. He'd never once been ashamed of our humble beginnings, or tried to distance himself from the teenage mother who'd sacrificed everything for him. As his voice had continued filling the room, discussing his upcoming charity gala and asking about my doctor's appointment from earlier that week, I'd watched my birth parents' expressions transform from contempt to desperate calculation. Richard had actually started to stand, as if he wanted to introduce himself to the phone, while Elizabeth had begun smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in the mirror above their fireplace. The irony had been delicious. For 55 years, they'd lived their lives believing they'd made the smart choice by throwing away an unwanted burden. They'd convinced themselves that discarding a helpless baby had been a necessary sacrifice for their social status and financial success. They'd never once wondered what became of that little girl they'd abandoned, never lost a moment's sleep over the daughter they'd decided wasn't worth keeping. But now, sitting in their perfect penthouse surrounded by their perfect things, they were discovering that the baby they'd thrown away had grown up to raise a man more successful, more famous, and more beloved than they could ever hope to be. The daughter they'd deemed worthless had produced a son who graced magazine covers, commanded headlines, and wielded the kind of influence money couldn't buy. I'd ended the call with our usual exchange of love and promises to talk tomorrow. Marcus reminding me to eat properly and rest well. The silence that had followed had been profound, broken only by the sound of Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath and Richard's nervous clearing of his throat. Their entire demeanor had shifted in those few minutes. The cold dismissal had been replaced by awkward attempts at warmth. The suspicious glares transformed into calculating smiles. Richard had actually gotten up and offered me a drink, his voice suddenly honey-sweet as he'd asked about my famous son's well-being. Elizabeth had moved closer, her previous disgust masked behind a facade of maternal concern, as she'd commented on how proud I must be. The change had been so dramatic, so transparently fake that I'd almost laughed out loud. These people who'd spent the first hour of our meeting treating me like a con artist were now practically falling over themselves to suddenly play the role of loving, concerned parents. They'd begun peppering me with questions about Marcus, his schedule, his projects, his personal life, all while pretending this newfound interest stemmed from grandparental affection rather than opportunistic greed. But I'd said nothing about my revelation, simply sat there, watching them scramble to reposition themselves now that they understood the true value of the daughter they'd discarded. I'd let them stumble through their pathetic attempts at building bridges they'd burned before I could even walk, their desperation growing more obvious with each passing minute. Richard had pulled out his phone and started showing me pictures of their various properties, suggesting that Marcus might enjoy visiting their home in Monaco or perhaps using their yacht for his next vacation. Elizabeth had begun discussing her various charitable organizations, wondering aloud if Marcus might be interested in becoming a spokesperson for any of their causes. They'd transformed from cold rejection to shameless manipulation in the span of a phone call, and I'd realized something that would shape everything that came next. These people weren't just the parents who'd abandoned me. They were predators who saw opportunity in everyone they met, including the grandson they'd never bothered to acknowledge until his success made him valuable to them. As the evening had worn on, and their desperation had become more obvious, I'd made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I wasn't going to let them simply waltz into Marcus's life and claim credit for the man I'd raised alone. They were going to pay for every year of abandonment. Every night I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't good enough to keep. Every sacrifice I'd made because they'd thrown me away like trash. But my revenge wouldn't be quick or simple. It would be as calculated and patient as the 55 years I'd waited for this moment. The weeks following that first meeting had been a masterclass in manipulation that would have impressed the devil himself. Richard and Elizabeth had transformed overnight from cold strangers into the most attentive birth parents anyone could imagine. Suddenly, my phone had been ringing daily with invitations to lunch, dinner, shopping trips, and family gatherings I'd never been invited to before. Elizabeth had started sending flowers to my apartment with handwritten notes about how much she'd missed me and how sorry she was for the years we'd lost. Richard had shown up at my door with expensive gifts and stories about how they'd thought about me every day since giving me up for adoption. The lies had flowed from their mouths as easily as water from a faucet, each one more elaborate than the last. But I'd played along beautifully, accepting their sudden affection with the wide-eyed gratitude of a daughter who'd finally found her parents' love. I'd let Elizabeth take me shopping for designer clothes, allowed Richard to introduce me to his business associates as his long-lost daughter, and smiled sweetly through family dinners, where they'd paraded me around like a trophy they'd won. All the while, I'd been gathering information. Every family story they'd told me, every business deal they'd mentioned, every social connection they'd bragged about had been carefully cataloged and researched. I'd discovered things about Richard and Elizabeth Thornton that would have made their high society friends clutch their pearls in horror. Richard's real estate empire had been built on a foundation of lies, fraud, and destroyed communities. He'd bought properties from desperate families for pennies on the dollar, then demolished entire neighborhoods to build his luxury developments. Dozens of families had lost their homes because of his greed, and he'd never shown an ounce of remorse for the lives he'd destroyed in his pursuit of wealth. Elizabeth's charitable organizations had been elaborate, tax shelters that funneled money back to their personal accounts while providing minimal help to the causes they claimed to support. The children's hospital she'd been praised for funding had received less than 10% of the donations meant for them, while the rest had disappeared into administrative costs that somehow always ended up benefiting the Thornton family. But their worst crime had been the pattern of abandoned children I'd discovered in my research. I hadn't been their only unwanted baby. Over the years, they'd fathered and birthed at least 4 other children with different women, each one quietly paid off and forced to disappear with their inconvenient offspring. My birth parents had made a habit of discarding their children like broken toys, never caring what happened to the lives they'd created and abandoned. The discovery had filled me with a rage so pure and focused it had frightened me. These people hadn't just abandoned me. They'd made abandonment their lifestyle, treating human beings like disposable objects that could be thrown away when they became inconvenient. Every one of those children had grown up without parents, just like I had, while Richard and Elizabeth had continued their perfect public lives without a care in the world. During this time, they'd been begging me to arrange a meeting with Marcus. Every conversation had somehow circled back to their desperate desire to meet their famous grandson, their voices dripping with fake emotion as they'd talked about wanting to make up for lost time and build a relationship with the family they'd never known they had. I'd strung them along perfectly, promising that Marcus would love to meet them while dropping hints about his upcoming projects, his financial success, and his generous nature. I'd watch their eyes light up with greed every time I'd mentioned his latest movie deal or charity donation, seeing the dollar signs practically dancing in their pupils. Marcus, bless his heart, had been initially excited about the possibility of meeting his birth grandparents. He'd grown up knowing the story of my abandonment, and had always wondered about the family we'd never known. When I'd first told him about finding Richard and Elizabeth, he'd been genuinely happy for me, thinking this might fill the hole in my heart that had ached for so many years. But as the weeks had passed and I'd shared more details about his grandparents' behavior, Marcus had begun to see through their facade just as I had. My son had inherited my ability to read people, and he'd quickly recognized the calculating nature of their sudden interest in our lives. He'd trusted my judgment when I'd told him I had a plan, even though I hadn't yet revealed the full scope of what I intended to do. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. I'd been laying the groundwork for months, building relationships with journalists, investigators, and lawyers who specialized in exposing corruption among the wealthy elite. I'd been documenting every conversation with Richard and Elizabeth, recording their lies and contradictions, building a case that would destroy their carefully constructed public image. But the real masterstroke had been the charity event I'd suggested they host in Marcus's honor. I'd convinced them to organize a massive fundraiser for children's charities, telling them it would be the perfect opportunity to publicly embrace their famous grandson while showing the world what caring grandparents they were. The event had been scheduled for the most prestigious ballroom in Manhattan, with guest lists that included everyone who mattered in their social circle. They'd thrown themselves into planning the event with desperate enthusiasm, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on decorations, catering, and entertainment. They'd sent out invitations to every influential person they knew, bragging about their relationship with Marcus Johnson and promising a night that would showcase their family's commitment to helping disadvantaged children. The irony had been perfect. They were planning to use a charity for abandoned children as a vehicle to exploit the grandson they'd never cared about, all while celebrating themselves as loving family members. They had no idea they were orchestrating their own destruction. As the night of the event had approached, I'd felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced in years. Everything was in place. Every detail had been carefully planned, and every person who needed to be there would be in attendance. Richard and Elizabeth were about to discover that the daughter they'd thrown away had grown into a woman who knew exactly how to return the favor. The morning of the charity event, I'd stood in my apartment bathroom applying makeup and thinking about the 2-day-old baby who'd been abandoned at St. Mary's Children's Home 55 years ago. Tonight, she was finally going to get her justice. The night of the charity gala had arrived with all the pageantry Richard and Elizabeth could buy. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel had been transformed into a glittering showcase of wealth and pretension, with crystal chandeliers casting sparkles across silk gowns and diamond jewelry. Every influential person in New York society had come to witness the Thorntons' public reunion with their famous grandson, their whispered conversations buzzing with curiosity about this family story that seemed too good to be true. I'd arrived early, watching from the shadows as Richard and Elizabeth had held court near the entrance, accepting congratulations and praise from their guests about their wonderful family reunion. They'd been dressed to perfection. Elizabeth in a custom Valentino gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. Richard in a tuxedo that had been tailored by the same man who dressed foreign dignitaries and Hollywood royalty. They'd been practically glowing with anticipated triumph, believing they were about to pull off the greatest social coup of their careers. In their minds, tonight would cement their position as not just wealthy philanthropists, but as the proud grandparents of America's most beloved actor. They'd been rehearsing their speeches for weeks, practicing the exact words they'd use to describe their joy at being reunited with their long-lost family. Marcus had arrived fashionably late, as his publicist had advised, making an entrance that had caused the entire ballroom to turn and stare. Even in a room full of celebrities and socialites, my son had commanded attention in a way that reminded everyone why he'd become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He'd been gracious and charming, accepting congratulations and posing for photos, while making his way toward the stage where he'd been scheduled to speak about his grandparents' charitable work. I'd positioned myself at a table near the back of the room, close enough to see everything but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. From my vantage point, I'd been able to watch Richard and Elizabeth bask in their moment of perceived victory, their faces radiant with the kind of satisfaction that came from believing they'd successfully manipulated everyone around them. The first part of the evening had gone exactly as they'd planned. Richard had given a speech about the importance of family and second chances, his voice trembling with what the audience had assumed was genuine emotion, as he'd talked about finding his daughter after so many years. Elizabeth had followed with remarks about their commitment to helping disadvantaged children, her words carefully crafted to paint them as lifelong advocates for the very population they'd spent decades ignoring. Then had come Marcus's turn to speak, and the atmosphere in the room had shifted as he'd approached the microphone with the expression I'd never seen on his face before. My son had looked out over the crowd of New York's elite, his jaw set with the kind of determination that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. But instead of delivering the grateful, emotional speech about family reunification that everyone had expected, Marcus had begun telling a different story entirely. He'd started talking about his childhood, about growing up with a teenage mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table, about wearing secondhand clothes and living in apartments where the heat didn't always work in winter. The audience had listened with growing discomfort as he'd described the reality of poverty in America, the way society treated single mothers like his own, and the struggles faced by children who grew up without the privilege that filled that ballroom. His voice had remained steady and clear as he'd painted a picture of the America that existed outside their bubble of wealth and comfort. Then he'd dropped the first bombshell. Marcus had begun talking about his research into the Thornton family's business practices, describing in detail how Richard's real estate empire had been built on the destruction of low-income communities. He'd named specific neighborhoods, mentioned families by name, and described how his grandfather had systematically destroyed the very communities his charity claimed to support. The room had grown deadly quiet as Marcus had continued, his actor's training allowing him to project his voice to every corner of the ballroom while maintaining the kind of commanding presence that made it impossible to look away. He'd pulled out documents and photographs, displaying them on the screens throughout the room as he'd methodically destroyed Richard's reputation with facts and evidence that couldn't be disputed or denied. Elizabeth's charitable fraud had been next, with Marcus exposing the financial records that showed how little money had actually reached the children and families who were supposed to benefit from her organizations. He'd shown bank statements, tax documents, and correspondence that proved years of deliberate deception and theft from the very people who needed help most. But the most devastating revelation had been saved for last. Marcus had looked directly at Richard and Elizabeth, his voice filled with quiet fury as he told the audience about the pattern of abandoned children, the multiple sons and daughters who'd been discarded and forgotten by the couple everyone thought they knew. He'd introduced several of my half-siblings who'd been seated throughout the audience, each one standing as their story was told. There had been David, now 43, who'd been given up when Richard was married to his first wife. Sarah, 38, abandoned when Elizabeth had been having an affair with a business partner. Michael, 29, discarded when his existence had threatened a lucrative merger. And Jennifer, just 24, given away when her birth would have interfered with a European vacation. Each of them had found their way to Marcus and me during the months of planning. Brought together by private investigators and a shared desire for justice, they'd all grown up in foster care or struggling single-parent homes, all wondering why they hadn't been good enough to keep, all carrying the same scars I'd carried for 55 years. As Marcus had finished speaking, the silence in the ballroom had been absolute. 500 of New York's most powerful people had sat in stunned shock, realizing they'd been celebrating 2 people who represented everything wrong with their society. The cameras that were supposed to capture a heartwarming family reunion had instead recorded the complete destruction of 2 carefully constructed public personas. Richard and Elizabeth had sat frozen at their head table, their faces pale and their carefully planned evening crumbling around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. The social triumph they'd orchestrated had become their public execution, broadcast live to a room full of people who would ensure the story reached every corner of their world before morning. But as I'd watched their faces transform from confident superiority to dawning horror, I'd realized that the real revenge was just beginning. The aftermath of that night had been more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. Within hours of Marcus's speech, videos of the entire evening had gone viral across every social media platform. The sight of 2 billionaires being systematically destroyed by the grandson they'd tried to exploit had captured the public's imagination in a way that transcended typical celebrity gossip. The financial consequences had been swift and merciless. Richard's real estate empire had collapsed within weeks as investors had fled. Government investigations had been launched, and lawsuits had poured in from communities he'd destroyed over the decades. His properties had been seized, his assets frozen, and his business licenses revoked in multiple states. The man who'd spent his life accumulating wealth, through the suffering of others, had found himself facing bankruptcy and potential prison time. Elizabeth's charitable organizations had been shut down by federal investigators. Her board positions had been revoked, and her social standing had evaporated overnight. The woman who'd built her identity on being Manhattan's most admired philanthropist had become a pariah, banned from the very society events that had once celebrated her contributions. But the most satisfying part of their downfall had been watching them try to rebuild relationships with the children they'd abandoned. David, Sarah, Michael, Jennifer, and I had formed a tight bond during the months of planning our parents' exposure, and we'd presented a united front in rejecting every attempt at reconciliation that had followed their public disgrace. They'd tried everything: expensive gifts, tearful apologies, promises to make amends for their decades of neglect. Richard had shown up at David's construction business with a luxury car and a speech about wanting to be a real father. Elizabeth had sent Sarah a check for $50,000, along with a letter claiming she'd never stopped loving her. Each gesture had been more desperate and transparent than the last. Their panic obvious as they'd realized the true cost of their lifetime of callous abandonment. We'd rejected them all, just as they'd rejected us when we were helpless children who needed their love and protection. The symmetry had been perfect. They'd thrown us away when we were vulnerable and worthless to them, and now we were discarding them when they were broken and worthless to us. Marcus had used his platform and influence to launch a real charity for abandoned and foster children, one that actually helped the kids who needed it most, instead of lining the pockets of wealthy board members. The foundation had been funded partly by the money recovered from Elizabeth's fraudulent organizations, and partly by Marcus's own substantial donations. My son had also purchased the children's home where I'd been placed as a baby, transforming it from an underfunded state facility into a model institution that provided real care, education, and support for children who'd been discarded by their families. He'd named it the Linda Mae Harrison Center for Children in Need, honoring the teenage mother who'd refused to abandon her child even when the world had told her she should. The 5 of us siblings had worked together to establish a legal fund that helped other abandoned children track down their birth parents and hold them accountable for child support they'd never paid. We'd turned our shared trauma into a weapon for justice, using our resources to ensure that other deadbeat parents couldn't simply disappear from their responsibilities the way Richard and Elizabeth had done to us. As for me, I'd finally found the peace that had eluded me for 55 years. The hole in my heart that had ached since childhood had been filled not by finding parents who loved me, but by realizing that I'd never needed their love to be complete. I'd raised an extraordinary son, built meaningful relationships with the siblings I'd never known existed, and proven that the children they'd thrown away had become infinitely better people than the parents who'd abandoned us. The last time I'd seen Richard and Elizabeth had been in a courtroom 6 months after the charity gala. They'd been there for one of the many legal proceedings stemming from their decades of fraud and abandonment, looking older and more broken than I'd ever imagined possible. Their expensive clothes and perfect grooming couldn't hide the defeat that had settled into their bones, the knowledge that they'd lost everything they'd spent their lives building. They'd tried to approach me afterward, their voices small and pleading as they'd attempted one final reconciliation. Richard had actually gotten down on his knees in the courthouse hallway, tears streaming down his face as he'd begged me to forgive him and give him a chance to be the father he should have been. Elizabeth had clutched at my arm, her voice breaking as she'd promised she'd do anything to earn my love and acceptance. I'd looked down at them with the same cold calculation they'd shown me 55 years earlier, feeling nothing but satisfaction at seeing them reduced to the desperate, pathetic creatures they'd always been beneath their wealth and social standing. Then I'd spoken the words I'd been rehearsing since I was 2 days old, lying in that hospital bassinet with nothing but a pink blanket and a note about love they couldn't give. I'd told them exactly what they'd told that helpless baby so many years ago, that they were worthless, unwanted, and not deserving of love or consideration. I'd explained that just as they'd decided I wasn't worth keeping, I'd decided they weren't worth forgiving. And then I'd walked away, leaving them broken and abandoned in that courthouse hallway, just as they'd left me broken and abandoned 55 years earlier. As I'd driven home that day, I'd thought about the scared teenage mother I'd been, holding Marcus in that county hospital and promising him a better life than the one I'd known. I'd kept that promise in ways I'd never imagined possible, raising not just a son, but a man who used his success to fight for people like us. The baby they'd thrown away had become a mother who'd changed the world, one abandoned child at a time. Justice had finally been served, 55 years late, but absolutely perfect in its completeness. Richard and Elizabeth Thornton had learned that the children they'd discarded weren't just statistics to be forgotten. They were human beings with the power to rise, to succeed, and to make their parents pay for every moment of pain they'd caused. The revenge had been worth the wait.